At the Easter party, my daughter-in-law handed me a giant chocolate egg, and inside it was something she thought would ruin me. I smiled when she gave it to me, right there on the patio behind Daniel's house, surrounded by pastel decorations and plastic eggs scattered across the lawn. Children were laughing, running between folding tables, their baskets bouncing against their knees as they searched for candy hidden in the grass. Someone had set up a long buffet with glazed ham, deviled eggs, and a cake shaped like a bunny, the kind of detail I used to take pride in organizing myself. Now, I stood there as a guest in my own family, holding a gift that felt heavier than it should have. "Open it later," Emily said sweetly, her voice just loud enough for the others nearby to hear. She leaned in and kissed my cheek, her perfume sharp and deliberate, like everything else about her. I thanked her, even hugged her, because that's what was expected. That's what I had always done. Kept the peace, kept the smile, kept the illusion alive. But the moment I took the egg into my hands, I knew something wasn't right. Chocolate doesn't weigh like that. Not even the oversized novelty kind wrapped in bright foil and tied with a ribbon. This one was dense, solid, almost unbalanced. I turned it slightly, pretending to admire the decoration, and noticed a faint seam along the side where the wrapper didn't quite align. It had been opened. Carefully. Intentionally. I didn't look at Emily right away. Instead, I scanned the yard, letting my eyes move slowly as if I were simply enjoying the afternoon. Daniel was near the grill, laughing a little too loudly at something his coworkers said, but he didn't once glance in my direction. That, more than anything, settled the quiet unease forming in my chest. My son had always watched me, checked in, made sure I was comfortable. Today he avoided me completely. I shifted the egg in my hands again. "Heavy. Too heavy. You should save it for dessert," Emily added, tilting her head with that practiced warmth she wore like a costume. I met her eyes then, just for a second. There was something there. Anticipation, maybe even excitement, but not kindness. Never kindness. I smiled back, slow and calm. "Of course," I said. Around us, the party carried on. A neighbor's kid squealed as he found a golden egg. Someone turned up the music, something light and cheerful that didn't quite reach me where I stood. I set the chocolate egg carefully into my handbag, making sure no one noticed how deliberate the movement was. Then I picked up a paper cup of lemonade and took a small sip, letting the sweetness sit on my tongue while my thoughts settled into place. Because whatever Emily had hidden inside that egg, she believed it would weaken me. She believed I would be surprised, maybe even humiliated. But as I stood there, watching my family laugh without me, I realized something else entirely. She hadn't given me a gift. She had handed me a message, and I had every intention of reading it on my own terms. I waited until the sun dipped just low enough to stretch the shadows across the yard before I excused myself from the table, carrying my handbag with the same calm rhythm I had practiced for decades, never rushing, never drawing attention, even when my heart had already begun to piece together a story no one had spoken out loud yet. And as I stepped inside the house, the noise from outside softened into a distant blur, laughter muffled by glass doors and polite distance, leaving me alone in a quiet kitchen that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and baked sugar, the kind of scent that used to mean comfort, but now only reminded me of how carefully everything had been staged, how every detail had a purpose I was only beginning to understand. And I set my handbag on the counter, not opening it right away, just resting my hand over the shape of the chocolate egg, as if I could feel the truth through the foil, as if it might reveal itself without effort. But things like this never reveal themselves easily. They are always hidden beneath layers, carefully wrapped and sealed, just like intentions, just like people. And I took a slow breath before finally reaching inside, lifting the egg out and placing it on the marble surface, turning it slightly under the kitchen light, noticing again how the wrapper did not quite align, how the ribbon had been tied just a little too tightly as if to keep something from shifting inside. And I began to unwrap it with steady fingers, peeling back the foil in careful sections, not tearing it, not rushing, because whatever Emily had hidden here, she had expected a reaction, something immediate and emotional, and I had no intention of giving her that. Not now, not ever. And when the chocolate shell was finally exposed, I paused again, running my fingertips along the seam that had been resealed, feeling the slight unevenness where it had been pressed back together, and with a gentle pressure, it gave way, splitting open cleanly into two halves that revealed not candy, not anything sweet or celebratory, but a stack of folded documents tucked neatly inside, as if they had always belonged there, as if this had always been their purpose, and I stared at them for a moment, not touching them yet, just letting the reality settle into place, because deep down, I had already known this was not a gift. This was a message, and I unfolded the papers slowly, smoothing them against the counter, my eyes moving across the printed lines, the legal language, the signatures, the dates, and it did not take long to understand what I was looking at. A property transfer agreement, my property, the house I had lived in for over 30 years, the one Daniel grew up in, the one I had maintained, paid for, protected, now reduced to a set of documents that suggested it was already in the process of becoming something else, something no longer mine. And at the bottom, there was a space marked for my signature, empty, waiting, as if this had been planned as the moment I would be persuaded, embarrassed, or cornered into agreeing. And I let out a quiet breath, not of shock, but of recognition, because this was not sudden, not really. It was simply the first time the intention had been placed directly in my hands. Undeniable, undeniable in a way that all the small signs before it had not been. And I thought back to the past year, the subtle changes, the conversations that shifted when I entered the room, the way Emily would speak about future plans with a tone that always excluded me, the way Daniel had grown quieter, more distant, as if he had already stepped into a life where I was no longer part of the foundation. And I folded the papers again, carefully, exactly as they had been, placing them back inside the hollow shell before setting the two halves together again, pressing them lightly so they held their shape, because this was not the moment to confront anyone, not the moment to reveal that I understood. This was the moment to observe, to confirm, to let them believe. Their plan was still intact, and as I wrapped the foil back around the egg, smoothing it into place, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, the lines on my face softer in the fading light, my expression calm, almost serene, and for the first time that afternoon, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, not because I was pleased, but because I had just been given something far more valuable than what they thought, clarity. And with clarity comes choice, and with choice comes power, and as I picked up my handbag again and walked back toward the patio, I could already hear Emily's voice rising above the others, bright and cheerful, waiting, watching, expecting, but when I stepped outside, I carried nothing in my expression that would give her what she wanted, only the same quiet composure I had always shown, the same steady presence that had held this family together for years. Because if she believed this was the beginning of my downfall, then she had misunderstood me completely, and I was not about to correct her, not yet. I returned to the patio with the same steady pace, the same quiet smile, and no one noticed anything had changed, which was exactly what I expected because people rarely look closely when they believe they already understand the story in front of them. And Emily was standing near the dessert table, her hand resting lightly on the edge as she spoke to one of the neighbors, her laughter soft but deliberate. And when she saw me, there was a flicker in her eyes, quick and sharp, as if she were searching for something, a reaction, a crack, any sign that her little surprise had landed the way she intended, but I gave her nothing, not even a pause, just a polite nod as I set my handbag down beside my chair and picked up my lemonade again, letting the cold glass settle into my palm as if this moment were no different from any other. And for a few seconds she held my gaze, waiting, then her smile returned, wider this time, more confident, because my silence had confirmed exactly what she wanted to believe, that I had seen what was inside and that I did not understand it, that I would take it at face value, that I would follow the path she had already laid out for me. And that was when I realized just how far she had already gone, because this was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. This had been planned carefully, patiently, built over time with small adjustments and quiet manipulations that I had dismissed as harmless. And now they were all beginning to align in a way that felt almost too precise to be accidental, and I turned slightly in my seat, watching Daniel as he moved between guests, his shoulders tense in a way that did not match his easy smile. And when our eyes nearly met, he looked away, quick and practiced, as if he had already rehearsed that motion, as if he had known this moment would come and had chosen his role in it long before today. And something inside me settled then, not anger, not even disappointment, but a kind of clarity that comes when the last piece of a puzzle finally clicks into place. And I thought back to the first time Emily had suggested I consider downsizing, how she had framed it as concern, how she had spoken about maintenance and convenience, and how much easier life could be if I moved into something smaller, something more manageable. And at the time I had smiled and thanked her, believing it came from a place of care, but now I could see the pattern, how often she had brought it up, how casually she had mentioned real estate values rising in the neighborhood, how she had once joked about how wasted all that space was on just one person, and I remembered the day. Daniel had asked me about my will, how he had tried to sound casual, how he had said it was just practical to have things organized, and I had agreed, because I had always believed in being prepared, in making things easier for the people I loved, and I had trusted that love was still the foundation of this family. But trust, I was beginning to understand, can be reshaped quietly, slowly, until it becomes something else entirely, something that serves a different purpose. And I took another sip of my drink, letting the cool sweetness ground me as I watched the children run past, their laughter bright and unaffected, unaware of the currents moving beneath the surface of the day, and I envied them for a moment. That simplicity, that certainty that what they saw was all there was, because adulthood teaches you otherwise, teaches you that the most important things are often hidden, wrapped carefully in something that looks harmless, something that invites you to accept it without question. And I glanced at my handbag again, resting beside my chair, the chocolate egg tucked neatly inside as if it were still just a festive treat, and I felt a quiet sense of control settle over me, because Emily had assumed I would react, that I would confront her or Daniel or anyone else the moment I understood what those papers meant. But she had underestimated something far more important than my age or my patience. She had underestimated my ability to wait, to observe, to let people reveal themselves completely before I decided what to do next. And as the afternoon carried on and the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden light across the yard, I found myself listening more than speaking, watching more than engaging, noting every glance, every shift in tone, every small detail that confirmed what I already knew, that this was not just about a house or a set of documents. This was about control, about who would decide what happened next, and for the first time in a long while, I understood that the choice was still mine, even if they believed otherwise. And that realization did not come with noise or confrontation. It came quietly, like everything else that truly matters, settling into place with a calm certainty that no one else at that table could see. And I let them keep believing their version of the story, because for now, that was exactly where I wanted them to be. The rest of the afternoon unfolded exactly as I expected, not in dramatic gestures or obvious confrontations, but in the quiet, almost invisible ways people reveal their intentions when they believe they are unobserved. And I found myself paying attention to things I might have overlooked before, the way Emily hovered just a little too close whenever I spoke to someone, the way she inserted herself into conversations that did not involve her, always steering them gently back toward topics that circled around homes, investments, future plans, as if she were laying a foundation in plain sight. And each time she did, she glanced at me briefly, measuring, calculating, waiting for a reaction that never came, and I let her have that silence because silence can be more revealing than any argument. And across the yard Daniel continued to play his part, attentive host, easy smile, but there was a stiffness to him now, a hesitation in the way he moved, as if he were balancing two versions of himself and was no longer sure which one would hold. And I watched him carefully, not with accusation, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, because this was not just about what Emily had done, this was about what he had allowed, what he had agreed to, and perhaps what he had convinced himself was reasonable. And that thought lingered as I set my empty cup down and adjusted my chair slightly, turning just enough to catch fragments of a conversation happening near the far end of the table, two of Emily's friends speaking in low voices, not realizing how clearly their words carried in the open air. And I did not need to hear everything, just enough to understand the direction of it, a mention of timing, of listings, of how quickly properties in this neighborhood were moving, and then a soft laugh followed by a phrase that settled into my mind with quiet certainty. Once everything is signed. And I felt something shift inside me then, not surprise, not even disbelief, but confirmation. The kind that leaves no room for doubt, because this was no longer speculation. This was a plan already in motion, a plan that assumed my cooperation as if it were inevitable, and I leaned back slightly, letting the sunlight warm my face while I considered what that meant, how long it had been unfolding, how many conversations had taken place without me, how many decisions had already been made in rooms where my name was spoken as if I were no longer present. And yet here I was, sitting at the same table, listening, watching, understanding more than they realized. And for a moment, I allowed myself to remember what that house had meant to me, not in a sentimental way, but in the steady accumulation of years, the small repairs done on quiet weekends, the seasons marked by the garden changing outside the kitchen window, the sound of Daniel's footsteps running down the hallway when he was a child, all of it layered into something far more substantial than what could ever be written on a piece of paper. And perhaps that was what Emily did not understand. That a home is not just an asset to be transferred or divided. It is a history, a foundation. And taking it is never as simple as signing a document, no matter how carefully that document is presented. And as that realization settled, I found my attention returning to the present, to the people around me, to the roles they were playing so confidently. And I saw Emily again, laughing, gesturing with her hands as she spoke, her expression open and charming. And for anyone else it would have been convincing. But I could see the precision beneath it, the way she monitored every reaction, every response, always adjusting, always guiding the narrative forward. And I understood then that she believed she had already won, that this afternoon was simply a step in a process that would end exactly as she intended. And I let that belief remain untouched, because correcting it now would serve no purpose. And instead I reached for my handbag once more, resting my hand lightly against it, feeling the presence of the chocolate egg inside, the weight of it unchanged, but its meaning completely transformed. And I realized that what she had placed inside it was not just a trap, it was a timeline, a glimpse into what they expected to happen next. And with that knowledge came a quiet certainty that I had something far more valuable than they did. I had time, I had awareness, and most importantly, I had not yet made a single move. And as the evening light softened and the party began to wind down, I remained exactly where I was, composed, attentive, and entirely certain that whatever came next would not unfold the way they imagined. As the last of the guests began gathering their things and the soft hum of conversation faded into polite goodbyes, I remained seated just long enough to watch how everything concluded, because endings often reveal more than beginnings. And Emily moved through the crowd with effortless grace, hugging, smiling, thanking everyone for coming, as if she had orchestrated not just the party, but the entire narrative of the day. And when she finally approached me, her expression carried that same carefully measured warmth, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, and she placed a light hand on my shoulder, asking if I had enjoyed myself, her tone gentle but her gaze searching, always searching. And I nodded, offering a simple answer, something agreeable, something that gave her nothing to question. And for a brief moment, she seemed almost disappointed, as if she had expected more, perhaps a hint of confusion or concern, something she could respond to, something she could guide, but instead she found only calm, and that calm unsettled her in a way she could not openly acknowledge. And I saw it in the slight tightening of her smile before she stepped back, turning her attention elsewhere, already adjusting, already recalibrating. And Daniel followed soon after, his hands tucked into his pockets, his posture uncertain, and he lingered beside me for a second longer than necessary, as if there were something he wanted to say but could not find the words. And I looked at him. Then, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a quiet steadiness that seemed to make him even more uncomfortable. And he cleared his throat, asking if I needed help carrying anything to my car. And I shook my head gently, telling him I was fine, because I was, more than he realized, more than any of them realized. And that seemed to settle something for him. Or perhaps it allowed him to believe that everything was proceeding as expected. And he nodded, offering a small, almost relieved smile before stepping away, leaving me alone with the final pieces of an afternoon that had revealed far more than it intended to. And I stood slowly, smoothing the fabric of my coat as I reached for my handbag, feeling again the weight of the chocolate egg inside. No longer a mystery, no longer a question, but a confirmation. And as I walked toward the driveway, the cool evening air settling around me. I allowed myself to think not about what had been done, but about what would come next, because that is where the real decisions are made, not in the moment of discovery, but in the moments that follow, when you choose how to respond. And I paused briefly beside my car, glancing back at the house, the lights still glowing warmly through the windows, the silhouettes of people moving inside, unaware of the shift that had already taken place, unaware that the balance they believed they controlled had already begun to change. And I opened the car door, placing my handbag carefully on the passenger seat before sitting behind the wheel, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as I considered the path ahead. And it was clear now that whatever they had planned relied on my silence, my compliance, my willingness to follow along without question, and I had given them exactly that, at least for today. But silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes it is the space where understanding becomes strategy. And as I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, leaving the house behind me, I felt no urgency, no need to act immediately, because patience had always been my strength, and now it would be my advantage. And whatever came next would not be rushed, not forced, but chosen with care, because this was no longer their story to control. Not entirely, not anymore. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows thoughts to settle into something sharper, something more defined. And as the houses passed by in steady rows, each one lit with soft evening light, I found myself replaying not just the events of the day, but the months that had led up to it. Each conversation, each suggestion, each small shift that had seemed harmless at the time now forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. And by the time I turned onto my street, I was no longer questioning what had happened, only considering what it meant and what I would do with it. And when I pulled into my driveway, the familiarity of my own home greeted me with a sense of calm that felt almost grounding, the porch light casting a warm glow over the front steps, the same steps I had walked up and down for decades without ever imagining that one day someone would try to take it from me with a piece of paper hidden inside a holiday gift. And I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a quiet click, the silence of the house wrapping around me in a way that felt steady, reassuring. And I placed my handbag on the kitchen counter once more, taking out the chocolate egg again, setting it down carefully, as if it were something fragile, though I knew now it was anything but. And I unwrapped it again, more deliberately this time, opening the shell and removing the documents with a calm that came from understanding rather than shock. And I spread them out across the table, reading each line again, slower now, more thoroughly, noting not just what was written, but how it was written, the language chosen, the structure, the assumptions built into it. And it became clear that this was not something drafted casually. It had been prepared with intention, likely reviewed, possibly even finalized to the point where all it required was my signature to set everything in motion. And I noticed the dates, the references, the clauses that outlined a transfer under the appearance of convenience, framed as a decision made in my best interest. And that detail alone told me exactly how they intended to present it, not as something taken, but as something I would willingly give, something I would be persuaded into believing was necessary. And I sat down at the table, folding my hands together for a moment as I considered the simplicity of their plan, because on the surface it was effective. It relied on assumptions about who I was, about what I would accept, about how I would react. And for a long time, those assumptions might have been accurate. I had been accommodating, trusting, willing to avoid conflict for the sake of keeping peace within the family. But what they had failed to consider was that time changes more than circumstances. It changes perspective. And as I looked at those documents, I realized that I was no longer the person they had based their plan on. And that realization shifted something fundamental, something that had been quiet for years but was now fully present. And I reached for a drawer beside the table, pulling it open to retrieve a small folder, one I had kept organized for my own records, my own decisions, things I had never felt the need to share in detail because I had trusted that they would not be necessary. And I placed it beside the documents from the egg, not opening it yet, just letting it sit there as a reminder that there were parts of this story they did not know, parts they had not accounted for. And as I leaned back slightly in my chair, the weight of the day settling into a calm clarity, I understood that whatever they believed was already decided was, in fact, only just beginning, and that the next steps would not belong to them, not entirely. because now I had seen everything I needed to see, and I was ready to decide how this would unfold, not with haste, not with confrontation, but with the same quiet precision they had used, only this time. I would be the one in control. That night, I did not rush into anything, because rushing is what people expect when they believe they have cornered you. And instead I moved slowly through the house, turning off lights one by one, letting the quiet settle in naturally as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. And when I returned to the kitchen, the documents were still there on the table, neatly arranged beside the folder I had taken from the drawer. And I sat down again, this time opening my own folder with a level of focus that felt almost deliberate, almost ceremonial, because inside it were not just papers, but decisions I had made long before any of this began, decisions I had never felt the need to announce, and I flipped through them carefully, reviewing details I already knew but wanted to see again with fresh eyes, dates, signatures, legal notes, all of it organized in a way that reflected how I had always handled things, quietly, thoroughly, without drawing attention, and it did not take long to find what I was looking for, a document that, at the time, had seemed like nothing more than a precaution, something practical, something responsible, but now it carried a different kind of weight, a different kind of relevance, and I rested my hand on it for a moment, considering how easily assumptions can lead people in the wrong direction, how confidently they can build plans on incomplete information, believing they understand the full picture when in reality they are only seeing what they expect to see. And I realized then that Emily and Daniel had made a fundamental mistake, not in their execution, but in their understanding. They had assumed that I had done nothing, that I had left everything as it was, waiting, unprotected, available, and that assumption had given them the confidence to move forward, to prepare documents, to plan conversations, to set timelines, all based on a version of me that no longer existed. And I allowed myself a small, thoughtful pause before placing the document back into the folder, closing it gently, not because I was finished, but because I understood that this was not the moment to act openly. This was the moment to let them continue, to let them reveal every detail of their plan without interference. And I stood up, carrying both the folder and the documents from the chocolate egg to the living room, placing them on the coffee table where I could see them clearly, not hidden, not ignored, but present, a quiet reminder of the two paths now in front of me, one that followed their expectations and one that followed my own decisions. And I chose to sit there for a while, simply observing, letting the stillness of the room sharpen my thoughts, because clarity does not come from reacting, it comes from understanding, and the more I thought about it, the more I saw how predictable their next steps would be. A conversation, carefully framed, perhaps in a few days or a week, presented as concern, as practicality, as something that needed to be addressed sooner rather than later, and they would expect hesitation, maybe even resistance, something they could work through, something they could manage, but what they would not expect was readiness, not from me, not in the way I was beginning to define it. And as that realization settled into place, I felt a calm sense of direction take hold, not urgency, not anger, but intention, and I knew then that whatever happened next would not be decided in that moment, but in the moments leading up to it, in the choices I made quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention, because sometimes the most powerful move is the one no one sees coming. And as I finally stood to head upstairs, turning off the last light behind me, I left the documents exactly where they were, untouched, waiting, just as they had been left for me, because soon enough, they would serve a purpose neither of them had planned for, and I intended to make sure of that. The next morning arrived without urgency, just a quiet stretch of sunlight across the kitchen floor and the steady rhythm of routine that I had followed for years, and I made my coffee the same way I always did, measuring carefully, waiting for it to brew, letting the familiar process ground me before anything else, because routines have a way of reminding you who you are when everything else begins to shift. And when I carried the cup into the living room, the documents were still exactly where I had left them, untouched, unchanged, as if they were waiting for a decision that had already begun forming long before I sat down again. And I did not reach for them immediately. Instead, I sat back and allowed myself a moment to observe the stillness of the room, the quiet contrast to the noise of the previous day. And it was in that quiet that the next step became clear, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of something I had already set in motion without realizing how important it would become, and I leaned forward then, picking up the documents from the chocolate egg and sliding them into a neat stack, placing them beside my own folder, aligning them carefully as if they belonged together, two versions of a future laid side by side. And I opened my folder again, this time not just reviewing but confirming, reading through each page with a deliberate focus that left no room for doubt, checking details, verifying dates, ensuring that everything was exactly as I remembered. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that certainty comes not from assumption, but from verification. And when I finished, I closed the folder with a quiet sense of assurance, not satisfaction, but clarity, and I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I needed, someone I had not spoken to in a while, but trusted for a reason, someone who understood how these things worked beyond surface appearances, and I paused for just a second before making the call, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the weight of what I was about to set in motion. And when the line connected, my voice was steady, calm, as I explained that I needed to review some documents, that I wanted to ensure everything was in order, that I preferred to handle things carefully rather than assume, and there was no urgency in my tone, no hint of conflict, just a quiet request for clarity, and that was enough. Because people who understand these situations do not need drama to recognize importance, they recognize it in the details, in the timing, in the choice to act before something becomes irreversible. And when the call ended, I set the phone down gently, feeling the shift that comes when a decision moves from thought into action, not visible to anyone else, not announced, but real, and I gathered the documents once more, placing them back into my handbag with the same care I had used the day before, because they were no longer just evidence of someone else's plan. They were now part of my own, and as I stood and moved toward the front window, looking out at the quiet street, the same houses, the same calm surroundings that had always felt permanent, I understood that nothing about this situation required noise or confrontation to change. It required patience, precision, and the willingness to let others believe they were still in control while everything quietly shifted beneath them. And as I turned away from the window, already thinking ahead to the conversation I knew would come, I felt a sense of calm certainty settle deeper than before, because whatever they had planned was now only one part of a much larger story, and I was no longer just reacting to it. I was shaping what came next. 3 days passed before the conversation came. Exactly as I expected, not rushed, not forced, but carefully placed at a time that felt convenient, almost casual, as if it had simply occurred to them in that moment rather than being planned well in advance. And it was Daniel who called first, his voice measured, polite, asking if he and Emily could stop by later that afternoon, saying they wanted to talk about something important, but nothing serious. The kind of reassurance people offer when they are hoping to control how you receive what comes next. And I agreed without hesitation, my tone calm, welcoming, giving him no reason to suspect that anything had shifted beneath the surface. And when they arrived, everything unfolded with a quiet predictability that almost felt rehearsed. Emily carrying a small container of pastries as if she were bringing a simple gesture of kindness. Daniel stepping in behind her with that same careful posture I had noticed before, and I led them into the living room, offering coffee, creating the same environment of comfort they had expected, because comfort makes people confident, and confidence makes them reveal more than they intend. And it did not take long for Emily to begin, her voice soft, considerate, explaining how they had been thinking about the future, about what would be best for everyone, about how maintaining a house of this size could become overwhelming. And I listened without interrupting, my hands folded loosely in my lap, my expression attentive but neutral, allowing her to move through each point exactly as she had planned. And when she finally mentioned the idea of transferring the property, framing it as a way to simplify things, I simply nodded, as if I were considering it for the first time, even though every word aligned perfectly with what I had already read, already understood. And then Daniel spoke, adding his own layer of reasoning, talking about practicality, about how they could manage everything more efficiently, about how it would give me peace of mind. And I let him finish, because sometimes the most important part of a conversation is not what you say, but what you allow others to say fully, without interruption, without resistance. And when the room finally settled into a brief silence, I stood up slowly and walked to the coffee table, picking up the documents they had hidden so carefully inside that chocolate egg, and I returned to my seat, placing them gently in front of them, watching the shift in their expressions as recognition set in, subtle at first, then unmistakable, and Emily's smile faltered for just a second before she tried to recover, asking lightly if I had found them interesting, as if this were still something she could guide, something she could shape. And I met her eyes calmly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, and I told her that I had read them thoroughly, that I understood exactly what they were designed to do. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because this was not the reaction they had prepared for. This was not the version of me they had planned around. And I reached for my own folder then, placing it beside their documents, opening it slowly, deliberately, revealing pages they had never considered, decisions I had made long before this conversation ever took place. And I explained, in the same calm tone I had used throughout, that the property in question had already been secured in a way that did not allow for the kind of transfer they were proposing, that it had been placed under protections that ensured it would remain exactly where I intended it to be, regardless of external pressure or persuasion. And I watched as the understanding settled over them, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet inevitability that could not be undone. And Emily leaned back slightly, her expression shifting from confidence to calculation, searching for a new angle, a new approach, while Daniel looked down at the papers, his silence heavier now, more revealing than anything he could have said. And I allowed the moment to sit, not rushing to fill it, not pushing it further, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear. And after a few seconds, I closed the folder gently, resting my hands on top of it, and I told them that I appreciated their concern, that I would continue to manage my affairs in the way I saw fit, and that there was no need for further discussion on the matter. And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any argument could have, because it left no space for negotiation, no space for reinterpretation, only a boundary that had been set quietly but firmly. And as they sat there, processing what had just happened, I realized that the shift I had felt days earlier had now become visible, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the calm certainty of a decision that could not be undone. And whatever they had believed would unfold had ended before it truly began, not because I fought it, but because I understood it completely, and in that understanding, I chose a different ending.